I was stirring my coffee when I heard her voice behind me, soft but sharp enough to pull me out of the quiet hum of the cafe. I turned, and there she was, Vanessa, looking smaller than I remember, yet somehow impossibly luminous, as though the light had found a way to gather around her even in the most ordinary corner of the room. Her eyes met mine, and for a moment, I felt the weight of everything we hadn't said, everything I hadn't noticed while standing still in my own quiet orbit. Amez você de longe por tempo demais, she said, the words almost trembling, slipping from her lips with a smile that didn't reach the corners of her eyes at first. There was a tension there, a delicate thread of vulnerability that pulled me closer without her touching me. I didn't answer right away. I just let the moment stretch, measured the distance between us, and then spoke with the calm certainty I usually reserved for myself. Delange, come closer and live this with me. The words seemed to settle the air, not like a promise, but like an opening. Vanessa blinked, and in that pause, I could read 1,000 questions she hadn't asked yet. Could she trust it? Did she dare to step forward? Was it safe to believe in someone's quiet persistence? I didn't push. I only offered the space for her to make the first choice, because I knew that sometimes the smallest act of courage begins in the silence between two breaths. She slid into the chair across from me, hesitant but deliberate. Her hands were folded, tense yet searching for something familiar. I watched them, the way they moved, the small gestures that revealed more than she would ever say out loud. We ordered coffee again, though it hardly mattered. The air between us had shifted, charged with something neither of us could name yet. Vanessa spoke then, her voice lower, almost confessional. She talked about fear, the kind that lingers in the quiet moments, the kind that convinces you that waiting is safer than acting. She spoke of distance, of self-preservation, of the long habit of watching from the edge. I listened, not to respond, but to absorb. My presence was a simple certainty. No judgment, no pressure, only the steady beat of someone who would stay. The cafe's chatter receded as I focused on her, on the soft rise and fall of her breathing, on the hesitant warmth that finally began to seep into her posture. We didn't need declarations or sweeping gestures. The world outside could wait. Here, in this unassuming corner, we were simply two people beginning to map the possibility of closeness. She smiled again, this time more openly, the edges of her fear softening, and in that smile, I recognized the spark of a choice finally made, not forced, not demanded, but quietly given, the kind that could unfold, slowly, into something neither of us could yet name but both of us wanted. The rest of the morning passed with small movement, sips of coffee, a glance at the shuffle of papers forgotten between us. No one else mattered, no past, no future, just the deliberate act of noticing each other. By the time we left the cafe, the world had resumed its pace, but we were already walking on a path that neither of us had expected, yet somehow, both had been waiting for. The days after that morning in the cafe carried a quiet tension that neither of us tried to define. I found myself thinking about her in the small spaces between tasks, in the pause before sleep, in the faint hum of streetlights outside my window. Vanessa wasn't someone who needed to be chased. She was someone who needed to be seen, in the steady, unhurried way that made presence a kind of protection. I knew that if I moved too quickly, the fragile trust she had started to extend might vanish like mist. When we met again, it was in the small park near her apartment, a place where trees whispered and the wind had no particular agenda. She arrived slightly late, pulling her coat tighter around herself, as though it could shield more than the cold. Her eyes darted over the benches before settling on, and I gave a small, unspoken nod. No questions, no demands, just acknowledgement. That's all she needed, realized. That, and space to breathe. We walked side by side, letting the silence stretch between us like a rope not yet tense, not yet loose, simply present. I could feel her apprehension in the way she shifted her weight, in the careful pace she chose, and I mirrored it, slow, calm, and deliberate. There was no rush to fill the quiet, no attempt to force the rhythm of words where there was none. Eventually, she spoke, voice tentative, almost shy. It feels strange to talk like this without any expectations. I glanced at her, catching the slight curve of her lips, and replied softly, perhaps because there doesn't need to be any. We can just be here. My words seemed to settle something within her, though I could not yet tell how much. We lingered near a small pond, watching leaves drift in lazy circles. She admitted, haltingly, that she had learned to guard herself, to measure every gesture, every word, because the world had conditioned her to expect loss. I listened, simply listening, letting my presence convey what words could not, that she did not have to perform courage or happiness, that she could exist in her vulnerability and still be safe. A breeze lifted a stray strand of her hair, and I reached out instinctively, tucking it behind. Her hand froze in its motion, hovering for a moment, then slowly retreated. It was enough. Just a quiet gesture. No claim, no pressure, just awareness. She smiled then, a small, almost imperceptible softening, as if the act alone told her she had not been abandoned. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the path, and she leaned slightly closer, not out of expectation, but because the weight of silence had shifted into something bearable, even comforting. I did not speak, because I did not need to. My calmness, my choice to remain steady, spoke for itself, and as we walked back toward the streetlights, I knew that something unspoken had begun to grow. A subtle, careful connection that neither of us could define yet, but both felt keenly. It was raining lightly the next time we met, and I remember thinking how ordinary it all seemed, yet how significant it felt. Vanessa appeared under the awning of the small bookstore where I'd been waiting, her hair damp and curling at the edges, and I offered her my umbrella. She hesitated, then allowed herself to step under it, close enough that our shoulders brushed, but not so close as to feel forced. There was a careful negotiation in the space between us, as though every inch carried its own meaning. We walked in silence for a while, the soft patter of rain the only soundtrack. I could feel her tension, the subtle stiffness of someone unused to being near someone who simply stood firm without asking for anything. It was an unspoken lesson I was giving her. Trust doesn't need to be rushed, and presence alone can be its own reassurance. After a few blocks, she stopped, her voice barely above the rain. I don't usually talk about this. She glanced at me, searching, as if weighing whether I was someone she could allow to witness her truth. I nodded, not in a gesture of judgment, but in acknowledgement. You don't have to explain. You can if you want, or you can just breathe. Either is fine. And then she began, not in long, dramatic confessions, but in fragments. Pieces of herself she'd hidden, fears she'd carried alone. Her words trembled occasionally, but she continued, drawn forward by something in my steadiness. I didn't interrupt, didn't offer solution. I simply listened, my hand occasionally brushing hers, just enough to remind her she wasn't facing it alone. There was a moment when she laughed softly at herself, the sound fragile yet real, and I felt a pull in my chest, the way one notices the first hint of light. She was beginning to see that not every connection came with expectation or disappointment, that even someone like me, quiet, steady, perhaps unremarkable in most ways, could offer a kind of safety that words could only hint at. The rain lightened, leaving the streets glistening, reflective. We found a small bench beneath a tree and sat, letting the world continue around us. She leaned slightly toward me, and I did not move. There was no rush, no need to close the gap artificially. The space between us was already alive with meaning, every silent moment deepening the trust she was slowly daring to place in me. By the time we parted, her eyes held something new, something unspoken but unmistakable, the realization that vulnerability did not have to be a weakness. She could lean, even just a little, and I would remain. And in that quiet, shared understanding, I felt the beginnings of a bond that had no grand declarations yet, but an undeniable gravity. The weekend arrived quietly, with the kind of calm that seems almost deliberate, the kind that invites small gestures to carry more weight than grand plans ever could. Vanessa agreed to come by my apartment under the pretense of helping me assemble a new shelf I'd bought. I watched her hesitate at the door, her coat still damp from the morning drizzle, the way her eyes scanned the room as if deciding whether it was safe to enter. I offered a small smile, a gesture of steadiness, and she nodded, the faintest exhale of relief escaping her. As we worked on the shelf together, our movements became a subtle choreography, passing screws, aligning boards, holding pieces steady. It was mundane, yet the intimacy and the shared purpose was palpable. She laughed quietly when a plank slipped from her grasp, and I felt the warmth of her trust settling into the spaces between us. There was no urgency, no expectation beyond the task, yet every brush of our hands, every shared glance, carried a quiet significance neither of us needed to articulate. We paused for coffee halfway through, leaning against the counter. She spoke about the small pressures that weighed on her, family expectations, the quiet dread of loneliness, the lingering shadows of past disappointments. I listened, letting my calm presence offer reassurance without advice, without the need to fix what wasn't broken. Simply being there, steady, seemed to matter more than any words could. At one point, she reached for the mug I held out, our fingers brushing, and I noticed the subtle shift in her posture. She relaxed slightly, as though the act itself confirmed something unspoken, that she could allow herself to belong in a space not dictated by fear. I didn't rush her. I didn't fill the silence. Instead, I let the quiet settle around us, letting her awareness grow at her own pace. By the time the shelf stood assembled, sturdy and unassuming, Vanessa leaned back and examined it, her eyes reflecting a mix of satisfaction and surprise. "I didn't think it would feel good," she said softly, a trace of wonder in her voice. I merely nodded, recognizing the small but meaningful truth in her words. Sometimes, the simplest acts, shared without pretense, could carry more weight than any grand declaration. We lingered in the apartment a little longer, neither rushing to leave. Every movement, every glance, seemed charged with the quiet confirmation that something was taking root between us. Not passion, not urgency, but the subtle gravity of trust, of presence, of choosing to be near someone with neither demand nor hesitation. The shelf stood firm, yes, but it was our shared steadiness, our mutual care in these small moments, that truly anchored us. It was late in the evening when Vanessa appeared at my door, unannounced, her expression carrying the weight of a day she hadn't wanted to face alone. I noticed immediately the slight tremor in her hands, the way her coat hung loosely as if she had surrendered some of her usual defenses. I didn't ask why she was here. I didn't need to. Some invitations are unspoken, and hers was clear enough in the way she looked at me, in the hesitation that softened into resolve. She stepped inside, letting the door close gently behind, and I offered a quiet smile, a simple acknowledgement that she was safe, no questions, no judgment, just the calm steadiness of someone who would remain. She sank into the couch, her shoulders folding in on themselves, and I brought over a blanket without a word. The gesture was small, but deliberate, enough to let her know she was not alone. She spoke after a long pause, her voice low, almost confessional. I just needed to be somewhere without pretending everything is fine." I nodded, sitting beside her at a respectful distance, allowing the space between us to carry the kind of comfort words often fail to deliver. She leaned slightly toward me, her head brushing against my shoulder, hesitant, yet seeking the support she had so rarely allowed herself. We sat there in silence, the kind that does not demand explanation, but invites understanding. The subtle rhythm of breathing, the quiet sound of the city beyond the windows, the occasional movement of her hand brushing against mine. These small moments carried more significance than any grand gesture ever could. She let herself exhale, a tiny, almost imperceptible release of tension, and I understood that this act alone marked a turning point. She was beginning to accept presence as protection. Hours passed, though neither of us moved from that quiet corner of the living room. She fell asleep slowly, her head resting fully against my shoulder, and I remained still, careful not to disturb the fragile trust she had placed in me. In that simple act of staying, she revealed more than words ever could, a willingness to allow herself to be, to lean, to exist without constant vigilance. When she stirred briefly, eyes fluttering open, she gave a small, tentative smile. I returned it with the quiet firmness I always carried, an assurance without demand, a choice that was hers to accept or retreat from. By the time she finally left the next morning, the air between us had shifted. The bond was no longer tentative. It had weight, presence, and promise. Something subtle had begun that neither of us could yet name, but both felt undeniably. We began seeing each other more regularly, but the pace remained deliberate, a careful rhythm that allowed space for both presence and independence. There were no dramatic declarations, no forced intimacy, only the quiet accumulation of moments, small decisions that signaled choice rather than obligation. Vanessa started showing up in ways that felt casual, almost accidental, but each time she arrived, the air between us carried more familiarity, more ease. I invited her to accompany me to the market one morning, and she agreed without hesitation. The sunlight fell through the tall windows of the grocery store, catching the stray strands of her hair, and I noticed how her expression softened each shared glance. She lingered at the produce section, examining fruits with a care I had never seen in anyone else, and I followed her lead, quietly choosing to mirror her pace. It was ordinary, mundane even, but in its ordinariness, it became extraordinary. We walked home carrying bags of fresh vegetables and bread, sharing small observations about the city and the people we passed. Vanessa spoke about her family briefly, the gentle frustrations and unspoken pressures that she had learned to navigate alone. I didn't offer solutions, but I did offer attention, a steady presence that communicated something she had not yet fully allowed herself to hear. You are not alone, and you are allowed to be here. Back at my apartment, we prepared a simple lunch together. She chopped vegetables while I boiled water for tea, our movements synchronized yet unspoken, each aware of the other's presence without needing to comment on. A small smile passed between us when we discovered we liked the same seasoning on the same vegetable. That tiny, trivial moment became a kind of punctuation mark, a reminder that connection doesn't require dramatic gesture, only attentiveness. As the afternoon stretched, Vanessa leaned back against the counter, looking around with a quiet smile, and I realized she was beginning to feel a sense of belonging. The subtle shift was visible in the way her shoulders relaxed, in the way she allowed herself to laugh freely at something minor, without the usual hesitation. I didn't guide it, didn't coax it, simply allowed it to happen. Presence had its own gravity, and slowly, imperceptibly, it drew her closer. Evening approached, and she lingered longer than she had any right to by our own unspoken agreement. No promises were made, no pressure applied. She chose to stay, and I honored that choice with the same calm constancy I offered in every other gesture. Each small decision, each simple shared moment, wove a subtle but unbreakable thread between us, a quiet promise of continuity that required no words, only the patient affirmation of mutual trust. Vanessa pulled away unexpectedly. It was subtle at first, a delayed reply to a message, a hesitation in returning my call, but enough to shift the rhythm we had slowly established. I noticed it immediately, not with alarm, but with quiet attention. She needed space, and I respected that. There was no rush, no insistence, no attempt to fill the void with words or presence she had not yet invited. Days passed with a careful distance. I maintained my routines, but her absence lingered in the corners of my awareness. I sent her a brief message, nothing elaborate. I'm not waiting, I'm here. When you want to walk with me, it's real. No urgency, no expectation, just the assurance that my steadiness. The response didn't come immediately, and I did not press. Patience was part of the bond we were forming. It was in the respect for her timing, her fears, and her choice to return when she was ready. When she finally appeared, it was late afternoon. The sky had shifted to a muted gold, and the streets smelled faintly of rain and drying concrete. She looked smaller somehow, the way people do when they carry their own uncertainty. But the moment her eyes found mine, a hesitant relief passed between us. There was no apology, no explanation necessary. The distance itself had spoken, and the reunion required only acknowledgement. We walked together without a destination, letting the city provide background noise to our quiet rhythm. She spoke carefully, fragment by fragment, about what had pulled her back, the weight of expectations she hadn't known how to share, the fear of leaning and not being held. I listened without interjecting, absorbing each pause, each hesitation, offering only the steady presence that had always been my way of saying, I remain. At one point, she laughed softly at something trivial, a sound unburdened by tension, and I realized that the slight step back had not undone our connection. It had tested it, revealed its strength. Our bond was not built on unbroken continuity, but on choices, daily, deliberate, patient choices that affirmed each other's willingness to be. We paused on a quiet bench, the sun dipping lower, casting elongated shadows that seemed to stretch between us and the city around. She leaned slightly toward me, tentative but deliberate, and I did not move to close the space. The distance between us was no longer fear. It was consideration, mutual respect, a conscious measure of trust being reestablished. In that small, ordinary act of returning, she had begun to see that presence is not ownership, that steadiness can speak louder than any insistence. Vanessa returned with a quiet determination I had come to recognize as part of her rhythm, hesitant yet deliberate, cautious but willing to engage. We met at the small park where the light softened through the trees, casting patterns on the ground like the faint fingerprints of time. She smiled, though subtly, as though testing whether the warmth she allowed herself to feel could persist without collapse. She spoke first, hesitating, words spilling in fragments. I've always loved carefully, she said. I measure every gesture, every word, expecting it to fail. Her voice trembled slightly, and I felt the weight of her years of self-protection pressing against the space between us. I nodded, letting the silence absorb her fears, letting my presence convey what words could not. I remain, without judgment, without We walked slowly, no destination, allowing our rhythm to emerge naturally. Her hand brushed mine once, and she pulled it back instinctively. I didn't comment, didn't reach to guide it back. The gesture itself, tentative, almost invisible, spoke volumes. Trust, I realized, is cultivated not in grand declarations, but in repeated, patient acknowledgments of presence. She paused near a small fountain, the water catching the light in delicate arcs. I think I'm starting to see that maybe I don't have to be afraid all the time, she murmured. I remained silent, my steady gaze affirming her tentative realization. She was beginning to perceive that vulnerability was not weakness, that leaning into presence did not demand surrender but simply choice. The afternoon waned, and she rested against the low stone edge of the fountain. We spoke in fragments, about books we loved, trivial city observations, the quiet curiosities that seemed insignificant, yet carried weight in their shared attentiveness. In every exchange, I allowed space for her to retract, to pause, to choose, understanding that trust is cumulative, built moment by moment. She laughed softly at a minor observation, the sound light yet grounded, and I felt the subtle shift in her stance, a relaxation that had not been present before. The weight of old fears was easing, replaced by the cautious comfort of recognition. Someone had chosen to remain consistently, patiently, without intrusion or demand. As we parted, her eyes held a fragile gratitude, a tentative belief that perhaps she could allow herself to exist in this space safely. I did not press her, did not offer promises, only the quiet acknowledgement that her return, her willingness to step forward, had begun to reshape her view of connection. The seed of belonging, and though it was small, it carried the certainty of growth. It was a quiet Sunday when Vanessa surprised me with a question I hadn't anticipated. We were sitting on the couch after a simple breakfast, the sunlight spilling through the blinds in warm, lazy stripes across the floor. She looked at me, hesitant, and asked, almost in a whisper, "Can I leave a toothbrush here?" I paused, studying her expression. There was no rush in her tone, no expectation, only a careful testing of boundaries, a small step toward something neither of us had named. I smiled, the kind of quiet, assured smile I reserved for moments that mattered without needing to be dramatized. "There's a drawer over there," I said, nodding toward the bathroom. "Anywhere you like." She hesitated, then laughed softly, the sound warm but uncertain, like a bird testing its wings for the first time. That tiny act, a toothbrush in a drawer, was ordinary in one sense, trivial even, yet in its simplicity, it carried a weight I could feel deep in my chest. It was a choice, deliberate and unpressured, a small declaration of trust and belonging that needed no ceremony. We spent the morning moving around the apartment, preparing lunch, sharing quiet observation. Every glance, every brief touch, a hand brushing against mine while reaching for a plate, her shoulder leaning against me slightly while stirring the pot, was a reinforcement of the subtle gravity between us. No words could fully capture it, yet every gesture mattered, because they were chosen freely, without obligation or expectation. Vanessa talked about her lingering the old habits of stepping back, of guarding her own heart as though it were fragile china. I listened, allowing the silence between explanations to stretch and settle. I did not offer solutions. I did not try to fill the space with reassurances that might feel like pressure. My presence was sufficient, steady, a promise made in quiet consistency rather than in dramatic statements. Later, we sat on the balcony with tea, watching the city stretch out beneath us. She rested her hand lightly on the railing, her gaze distant but untroubled. I recognized then that the smallest decisions often carry the most profound consequences. A toothbrush in a drawer, a hand extended and accepted, a willingness to exist in shared space without pretense. These were the acts that slowly redefined the boundaries of trust. By evening, as the sky darkened and the lights of the city flickered on, Vanessa smiled at me in a way that felt new, delicate, yet certain. She had begun to understand that she could choose to stay, to allow connection, without fear of losing herself. And in that unspoken understanding, something essential had shifted, a quiet, persistent bond taking root, unassuming, yet irrevocable. Months had passed, and the rhythm between us had grown almost imperceptibly but undeniably. Vanessa's hesitations had softened, replaced by a cautious trust that unfolded naturally in the spaces we shared. It was late afternoon, and we found ourselves on a bench in the park, sunlight slanting through the trees and casting long, golden streaks across the grass. She looked at me with that same tentative smile she had carried the first time she let herself rest near me, but now there was something steadier in her eyes, a recognition that she was choosing to stay. She repeated the words that had started it all, soft and almost shy. "I loved you from afar for too long." Her voice carried neither desperation nor regret, only acknowledgement, a quiet reflection of time spent learning how to let someone in. I reached for her hand, firm but gentle, letting the warmth of my touch speak what my voice could not, still with, "That's all that matters." She squeezed my hand, a brief, deliberate gesture, and I felt the weight of all the small choices that had brought us to this point. The silent afternoons, the unpressured touches, the shared moments that built trust rather than demanded it. There was no rush, no final declaration, just the simple, deliberate act of existing together in the same space, fully present and fully accepted. We sat in quiet for a long time, watching leaves drift and children play in the distance. The world seemed to stretch beyond us, yet it did not intrude. Each breath, each glance, carried meaning, the unspoken affirmation that something had begun between us that was subtle, yet irrevocable. I felt her leaning slightly closer, a movement that spoke volumes in its restraint. No grand gestures could have conveyed the same reassurance that her presence now provided. She spoke then, a soft murmur. "I never thought I could feel this. Safe." I nodded, knowing that safety is not about walls, but about consistent, deliberate choice. "You are," I said, "because we are choosing it, every day, together." The sun continued to descend, casting the park in hues of gold and rose. Neither of us moved to break the silence, because it was enough. We had arrived at the quiet certainty that comes not from promises, but from repeated, unwavering attention. Vanessa rested her head slightly closer to mine, not out of obligation, but from trust that had been earned and freely given. And in that small, simple closeness, I understood that what had begun as a whispered confession months ago had evolved into something. It was not loud, it was not dramatic, but it was profoundly ours. A life quietly chosen, moment by moment, presence by presence, and a bond neither of us could have anticipated, but both of us cherished.